The sun was setting over a quiet American town when the unthinkable happened. Sirens wailed, boots pounded the ground, and chaos erupted. In the middle of a deserted field, a U.S. Army general, one of the highest-ranking women to ever wear the uniform, was dragged, tied to a tree, and mocked by police officers who had forgotten the very oath they swore to protect. Her ribbons of honor glistened against the rope that bound her, a cruel reminder of her sacrifices for a nation now betraying her. Her lips trembled, not out of fear for herself, but out of fury, because she knew one call from her voice could awaken an entire military machine, a storm of power and justice that would descend upon those who dared to humiliate her. And when that call was finally made, nothing would ever be the same again. The evening sky burned red with the last traces of sunlight. A haunting silence lingered in the air, as though the world itself sensed a storm was about to break. Suddenly, the screech of police tires tore through the stillness. Doors flung open, and a group of officers in uniform stormed into the deserted field with arrogance dripping from their faces. Dragged between them was a woman unlike any other, an American general, one of the few women in history to rise to such rank. A living hero who had dedicated her life to the defense of her country. Her medals and ribbons shimmered against her uniform. Each one carried the weight of sacrifice, blood, and unshakable loyalty. But those glimmers of honor were bound by coarse ropes as the officers shoved her against a tree and tied her tighter. With every pull, they laughed as though humiliating her proved their power. "So this is your mighty general. Look at her now," one of them sneered. But the woman's eyes did not reflect fear. Instead, a quiet fire blazed within them, the fire of someone who had stared death in the face and never flinched. Her hands trembled not from terror but from fury and from resolve. With one discreet motion, she pressed a hidden device strapped beneath her sleeve, sending out a signal, a silent call that rippled through encrypted channels, racing across satellites to the very heart of the military machine she once commanded. The wind seemed to pause. The earth seemed to listen, as though the universe itself recognized the moment history would turn. The officers, drunk on their false victory, tightened the ropes and mocked her further, blind to the storm that was about to descend upon them. For while they believed they had broken a general, they had in fact awakened an entire army. And when that army arrived, justice would not whisper. It would roar. The signal left her trembling hands like a silent scream across the skies, invisible to the men who thought they had won, but powerful enough to shake an entire nation. As the ropes cut deeper into her wrists and the bark of the tree pressed painfully against her back, the general lifted her chin, refusing to let humiliation bend her spirit. The officers circled her like predators, savoring their catch. Their laughter echoed cruelly in the still evening. "Where's your army now, General?" one taunted, shoving her shoulder. Another spat on the ground near her boots, sneering. "Medals don't mean anything here. Out here, we own you." They didn't realize that every word they hurled at her, every insult, was fuel for the storm building inside her chest. The general's mind raced back to the battlefield. Memories of comrades who had fallen, of soldiers who had trusted her. Memories of nights spent in deserts and jungles where she had never given up, no matter how impossible the odds. Tonight was no different. She wasn't just a woman tied to a tree. She was a soldier, a leader, a warrior, and warriors never surrendered. Far away in military command centers lit with glowing monitors, alarms suddenly flared. A secure line blinked red. Analysts scrambled as encrypted coordinates appeared on screens. "General Avery's distress beacon," one shouted. Within seconds, voices overlapped, orders barked, boots thundered across hangar floors. Helicopter blades began to churn the night air while armored convoys roared to life, their engines growling. Like beasts awakened. "Mobilize. Delta teams mobilize. Armor units lock on her coordinates," a commander thundered. Across the country, soldiers who had once served under her clenched their fists, fury blazing in their eyes. They remembered her voice on the battlefield, her courage in the darkest nights, the way she had never abandoned them, and now, not one of them would abandon her. Back in the field, the officers grew bolder, dragging dirt across her uniform, tugging at her medals, mocking the symbols of valor they would never earn. One officer held his phone up, laughing as he recorded her humiliation, preparing to share it like a trophy. But the general's eyes, burning with unshakable resolve, locked onto him. "Enjoy your moment," she whispered, her voice calm, almost chilling. "Because when my people arrive, you won't even remember how to laugh." The men scoffed, unaware of the faint tremor in the ground beneath their boots. It began softly, like a distant storm, the kind no one notices until the thunder crashes. Overhead, the sky shifted. The wind carried a low rumble, and suddenly headlights began to flicker on the horizon. Rows upon rows of armored vehicles, each one bearing the insignia of the very military the general had given her life to serve. The first helicopters cut across the twilight sky, their rotors slicing the silence with a roar that made the officers' grins falter. The sound grew, louder, closer, until the field that had been their playground of cruelty became a war zone of fear. The general closed her eyes for a brief second, a tear slipping down her cheek, not of pain, but of vindication. Her call had been heard. Her army was coming. The ground shook harder now as dozens of military trucks barreled forward, soldiers dismounting with precision, weapons raised, faces grim. Floodlights snapped on, illuminating the field as if it were day. The laughter of the officers died instantly, their arrogance draining with every approaching bootstep. Panic flickered in their eyes, but it was too late. They had tied their own fate to that tree along with her. The general lifted her head proudly, her voice steady as the night erupted in chaos around her. "This uniform is not just cloth," she declared, her words carrying into the stunned silence. "It is a promise, one you have broken, and one they will now enforce." And as soldiers swarmed the field, surrounding the cops who had once thought themselves untouchable, the world tilted, because justice was no longer a concept. It was here. It had arrived in flesh, steel, and fire. The night that had begun with humiliation now cracked open into chaos, and as the floodlights burned down on the field, the once smirking officers stood frozen, their confidence bleeding away with every second. Soldiers in combat gear fanned, out in perfect formation, their boots pounding in rhythm like the drumbeat of judgment. Rifles raised, laser sights cutting through the darkness, and in the middle of it all the general stood bound, her posture unbroken despite the ropes digging into her skin, her eyes reflecting not fear, but a grim satisfaction as she watched the faces of the men who had mocked her only moments before twist with dread. Yet the storm was not only external, it was in her chest too, because behind the steel of her composure lay the ache of betrayal, the knowledge that those who had sworn to protect citizens had turned into tormentors. But her pain fueled her resolve. The air vibrated with the roar of engines as more convoys thundered into view. Armored vehicles surrounded the field like a steel wall. Helicopters hovered low, their spotlights sweeping across the trembling officers. And then a commanding voice shattered the air. "Untie her, now." The officers hesitated. Their hands twitched toward weapons, but the glow of red laser sights painted their chests and foreheads. The message was clear. Resistance was death. One by one their bravado cracked. Their heads dipped, their hands shook, and weapons clattered to the ground. Their swagger drained away as soldiers closed in. The ropes were cut swiftly. The general staggered forward, rubbing the raw marks on her wrists. Her body bore the evidence of cruelty, but her stance remained unbroken, her chin raised with the defiance of someone who had never once surrendered in her life. The floodlights caught the torn fabric of her uniform, the dirt smeared across her once proud ribbons, and yet in that very ruin there was majesty. Because dignity, she knew, was not given by medals or polished cloth. It lived in the spine that refused to bend, but even in surrender, the officers were not done. One desperate man lunged. His hand flashed from beneath his jacket, a pistol gleaming in the harsh light. He aimed not at the soldiers, but at the general herself. A final act of spite, the last shred of power he thought he could steal. Time fractured into silence. The world seemed to hold its breath. Soldiers tensed, eyes widened, but the general did not flinch. She simply locked eyes with the man, her gaze cold and unyielding. The crack of a sniper's rifle shattered the stillness. The pistol spun from his hand, clattering into the dirt as the officer collapsed with a scream. His wrist shattered, his arrogance extinguished. The silence broke into chaos. Soldiers surged forward, slamming the officers to the ground. Shouts of protest and rage were drowned beneath the mechanical thunder of helicopters, the bark of orders, the clanging of weapons against concrete. Within seconds, the predators were prey, restrained with brutal efficiency, their faces pressed into the mud they had once thought their domain. And in the center of the field, the general stood tall. Soldiers turned to her, waiting. The fury in their eyes burned hotter than any floodlight, but she lifted her hand, signaling silence. She did not want vengeance. She wanted justice. She wanted words that would echo far beyond the field. Her voice carried across the roaring engines, cutting sharp through the chaos. They thought they could bind me, humiliate me, strip me of my dignity. But they forgot something. I am not one woman. I am an army. I am every soldier who ever bled for this flag. Every family who ever sacrificed. Every life that was given for freedom. And tonight, justice is not mine alone. It is ours. The roar of the soldiers that followed shook the earth. It was not merely noise, it was a declaration, a judgment, a sound that carried across the night sky like a vow etched into eternity. It was so deafening that the captured officers flinched, shrinking into the dirt as though the sound itself were a weapon. And in many ways, it was. Because in that roar lay every ounce of loyalty, of rage, of honor that had once defined the very institution they had mocked by daring to tie her down. The general did not smile. She did not gloat. Instead, she walked forward slowly, her boots deliberate against the earth. Every soldier's gaze followed her. Every camera drone above hovered closer. Across command centers and television screens, millions were watching. Veterans in dimly lit homes saluted through tears. Families fell silent, their eyes locked on the image of the bound general now standing free, her wrists raw but her spirit untouchable. Children whispered her name in awe, and those who had grown weary of injustice felt a spark reignite within their chests. For what they witnessed was more than a rescue. It was a resurrection of honor. The captured officers knelt in the dirt, bound and trembling as the general approached. Her eyes were shards of ice, but her voice was steady. "You wear the badge of law," she said, her words low but carrying across the field. "But you broke it. You used power not to protect but to destroy, and now the whole world will see you for what you are." The floodlights swung, locking on the kneeling men. Cameras zoomed in, broadcasting their faces across the nation. There was no escape from this exposure, no shadow to hide within. The arrogance they had carried like armor now shattered under the relentless weight of truth. Around them, soldiers closed ranks. Boots struck the ground in unison, a thunderous rhythm that rattled the earth, a living wall of discipline and resolve. Their unified roar swelled again, drowning out the cries of the disgraced men, making it clear that tonight there would be no ambiguity. The line between honor and betrayal had been drawn, and those who had crossed it were kneeling in the dirt. The general's chest rose and fell, her breathing steady despite the storm inside her. She thought of every soldier she had led, every oath she had sworn, every life she had buried under folded flags. She thought of the silence that came after gunfire, on distant fields, and how she had always promised to stand for those who could not. Tonight was no different. "Ropes may bind a body," she said finally, her voice steady as stone, "but they cannot chain a spirit. And when one general calls, an entire army answers." The soldiers erupted again, their roar a wall of thunder, their faces lit not just by the floodlights but by conviction. And though the general's body bore the marks of cruelty, her spirit towered over the field, taller than any monument of stone could ever be. The night, once meant to break her, now belonged to her. The floodlights blazed down on the field like artificial suns, and the roar of engines settled into a steady hum. But the silence that followed was heavier than any noise. The captured officers knelt in the dirt, bound and trembling, their swagger, replaced with hollow eyes and broken pride. The soldiers who surrounded them stood like pillars of stone, rifles steady, eyes fixed forward, their discipline so sharp it cut the air. In the center of it all stood the general, her uniform torn, her wrists raw, her medals scratched, yet her presence unshaken, towering above the wreckage of betrayal. The night did not belong to the police anymore. It belonged to her, soldiers, to every oath that had ever been spoken under the flag fluttering above distant bases, and it belonged to every citizen watching across the nation, because this moment was no longer confined to the field. Drones had captured everything, broadcasting it live to command centers, news stations, and living rooms. Across America and beyond, millions were watching in silence. In kitchens, in bars, in quiet apartments where the glow of the television washed over stunned faces, people saw the truth unveiled. They saw one of their highest-ranking generals bound and mocked by those who were meant to protect, and they saw her rise from the dirt unbroken. Veterans stood at attention in front of their screens, their trembling hands raised in salute. Children whispered her name like it was something holy. Mothers clutched their sons tighter, fathers bowed their heads, and those who had lost faith in institutions, who had grown weary of corruption and cruelty, felt something stir inside them, a spark of belief reigniting. The general stepped closer to the officers, her boots sinking into the dirt they had tried to bury her in. Her eyes, sharp and cold, swept across the men who had mocked her. "You thought power meant cruelty," she said, her voice carrying into the cameras, into every ear tuned to the broadcast. "You thought the badge gave you the right to humiliate, to destroy, but power is not cruelty. Power is responsibility. And tonight, you face the weight of the responsibility you betrayed." The officers flinched under her gaze, their knees pressed deeper into the mud. The bravado that had once dripped from their voices was gone, replaced by the tremble of fear. Around them, soldiers shifted. Their boots struck the ground in unison, a deep rhythm, steady as a heartbeat. The field pulsed with energy, the air heavy with judgment. The general let the silence stretch, let the weight of her words seep into every trembling man kneeling before her, let it echo across every living room where millions were watching. "You thought ropes could strip me of my dignity," she continued, her voice steady, unwavering. "But dignity is not yours to give or take, it is mine, forged in sacrifice, forged in blood, forged in every oath I kept when others broke theirs." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "And tonight, you will learn what true power looks like. Not the power of badges or guns, but the power of loyalty, of honor, of a spirit that cannot be chained." The soldiers roared again, their unified cry shaking the ground. It was not just sound, it was an oath renewed, a bond reaffirmed. The captured officers lowered their heads further, their shoulders shaking under the weight of that sound, a sound that declared they had already lost long before soldiers touched them. A commander stepped forward, his voice sharp as a blade. "Secure the prisoners. Prepare transport." Soldiers moved in with swift precision. The officers were hauled to their feet, their wrists bound behind them. They were shoved forward toward waiting vehicles, their cries muffled by the roar of engines and the unyielding rhythm of boots. But before they were dragged away, the general raised her hand, halting the soldiers. She stepped closer to the men who had tied her to the tree. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every detail of her battered uniform, every line of exhaustion on her face, every glint of fire in her eyes. "You tied me here," she said softly, though her voice carried. "You laughed while you pulled these ropes. You spat on the medals you will never earn. But you forgot that I am not just a woman standing alone. I am every soldier who ever refused to bow to tyranny. I am every family who has ever buried a loved one draped in a flag. And when you mocked me, you mocked them. When you tried to humiliate me, you humiliated an entire nation." The silence that followed was deafening. The officers could not meet her eyes. The soldiers around them stood taller, prouder, their hands tightening around their weapons as if her words had poured fire into their veins. And then, With a steady voice that cut like steel, the general gave her final order. Take them away. The officers were dragged toward armored vehicles. Their bodies sagged, their protests meaningless. They were not just prisoners, they were symbols, stripped of arrogance, carried away into the night like the echoes of a failed storm. The general turned then, her gaze sweeping across her soldiers. For a heartbeat, the mask of iron cracked and the weight of everything she had endured pressed down on her shoulders. But then the fire returned. She stood taller, raised her raw wrists into the air, and faced the cameras. To every citizen watching, she said, her voice trembling not with weakness but with power, this uniform is not just cloth. It is not just ribbons or medals. It is a promise. And tonight, you have seen what happens when that promise is broken. But you have also seen what happens when that promise is kept. Her soldiers roared once more, their voices flooding the night. It was not just victory, it was resurrection. A reminder that the spirit of honor, once called upon, could never truly die. Across the nation, people wept. Some whispered prayers, others clenched their fists in renewed faith, and somewhere, in the quiet corners of the country, those who had lost hope felt a spark of fire return to their chests. The general lowered her arms. The helicopters rose higher, their blades thundering. The armored convoys rolled forward, carrying the disgraced officers away. The field, once a place of humiliation, had become a battlefield of redemption. And as the general walked forward, her soldiers falling into step behind her, the night carried her words like a vow across the land. Ropes may bind a body, but they cannot chain a spirit, and when one general calls, an entire army answers. The roar that followed shook the heavens. The night was no longer theirs, it was hers, it was the army's, it was the nation's, and nothing would ever be the same again.